She was the one living in the house at the time when all of this took place. The gun was found in her house, multiple letters are found in her house, and of course Marina was living in her house with her at the time. Hello, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new with us, then welcome. This is the second of probably 3, maybe 4 little chats we're gonna have about a documentary that caught my interest and that has become a point of fascination for me in regard to the JFK assassination. So let's talk about it. Last time we walked through the beginnings of the documentary and how he introduces us both to the JFK assassination in general, but specifically Ruth Paine's role in the interactions with Lee and Marina Oswald. Ruth came into their lives through the connection of a man named George de Mohrenschildt, who for certain had CIA connections, and it's not a stretch to believe he was a CIA asset himself. He invites these two groups, Michael Paine and Ruth Paine, and Lee and Marina Oswald, to the exact same party, and then none of them ever really have anything to do with him after that point. He skirts away and he does not return to the Dallas area. Strange. So Ruth Paine is someone who was not in Lee and Marina's life until February of 1963. So she literally, 9 months before the assassination, she comes into their lives and is in a critical role in their lives only for those 9 months. Very interesting woman. And the more that you dig into her background and her husband's background, we get just fascinating details that leave an increasing amount of questions. So let's get into today's material. Where we left it last time was the series of different interviews that Ruth Paine has given over the decades about this whole situation. And one commentator and author notes in this documentary that wherever you look in the JFK assassination lore, you almost always find Michael Paine and or Ruth Paine there to explain Lee Harvey Oswald's motives for us. Reminder that neither of them knew him before 9 months before the assassination. We get a little bit of the psychologizing. Max Good, the documentarian, does a wonderful montage of various times that Michael or Ruth explain away. He was a small man. He was looking to be great. He was an angry man. He was looking for a fight. He had bizarre beliefs and thought himself that he should be more important than he was. They're always there to give these almost always extremely negative perspectives on who Lee Oswald was. But neither of them knew him before February, and neither of them had any connection or contact with Lee during that whole summer. We are told that they go to this island called Noshawn Island, and Ruth goes up to this island in the Northeast that Michael Paine's family has owned, and they go up and they spend the summer. All of this despite the fact that supposedly Ruth and Michael were separated at this point, but she goes up to spend the summer at Noshawn Island with her children and with Michael's family. Lee is down in New Orleans, and Marina is at a boarding house, I believe, in Dallas. So this is the point in time where Lee Harvey Oswald, if you've seen the video of him passing out pamphlets, anti-Castro, pamphlets in New Orleans, that's what was happening during this time. The documentary goes into the question of whether or not there was a conspiracy, and if so, by who. So it walks us through the Warren Commission, and like we talked about last time, Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA that had been fired by JFK and who had a personal bone to pick with JFK, he is on the Warren Commission. He's one of the people entrusted by our president and by our nation to study what had happened during the JFK assassination, even though he had this problem with JFK. Very suspicious, that. And we are told that this is, of course, the first time that the term conspiracy theory is even used in modern parlance, and that's where this whole idea comes from, is that they were trying to brand anyone who didn't accept the Warren Commission as a conspiracy theorist. The stats show that the majority of the U.S. believes that Lee Harvey Oswald was not alone. And in fact, our own government found the same. We had the House Select Committee for Assassinations found that there was a conspiracy, that it was too late for them to discover who was in on it, but that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. Of course, that didn't come until after the Zapruder film had been released. I believe it was almost 10 years after the Warren Commission. So at the time of the assassination, the Warren Commission was the only official word from our government about what happened, but later the House Select Committee on Assassinations found what most of us believe, that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone and that there was some number of other people. And so I just want to point out, the belief that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone is not necessarily believing he didn't fire any shots. It's also not necessarily believing that he did fire shots. So you can have a discrepancy about where you stand on Lee Harvey Oswald, whether or not he was part of it, but a majority of people do not believe that he acted alone. We are given a little back look at the man of Michael Paine. Michael Paine is not as focused on as Ruth Paine because she had a much closer relationship. And not only that, but she was the one living in the house at the time when all of this took place. The gun was found in her house. Multiple letters are found in her house. And of course, Marina was living in her house with her. And so people kind of honed in on Ruth Paine, but we're going to look a little bit at Michael Paine. Michael Paine actually hung out with Lee Harvey Oswald 6 different times, according to his testimony. And get this. Okay, so what do you do when you are just an innocent guy who just wants to hang out with a guy who just came back from defecting to Russia, and you're a wealthy person from the Northeast who's a Christian, and this guy is a former Marine who was orphaned and had no religion and very strong views about lots of things. They go to political meetings, of course, and it's not just of one sort. He testifies in this movie, there's quotes of him saying they went to leftist meetings, they went to right-wing meetings, they went to all different kinds because that was an interest that they shared. They would talk about extremist political views together. Is that what you do with your friends? Is that what anyone you know does with their friends? Well, we find out that Michael Paine comes from a long line of American patriots. He goes back all the way to Payne, Cabot, and Emerson as some of his forebears. The Payne is the Revolutionary War Payne. Not only that, but he works for Bell Helicopter, which is a known military-industrial contractor. He does have top secret clearing, and many people believed that he was posing both as pro and anti on the Cuban and Russian sides of things, that he was actually perhaps an agent provocateur, or that he was just keeping tabs on the extremes in the political atmosphere in Dallas, and that Lee Harvey Oswald was doing the same. And this is not outside the realm of possibility because there are known times of Lee Harvey Oswald passing out anti-Cuban, pro-Cuban, attending meetings for some, joining organizations for others. And so this was a common action of the CIA at this time, to not only be stoking two extreme views, which definitely applies to the modern world, right? That wanting division on a key issue, but also monitoring those things. And so if you're of the viewpoint, which I think increasingly I am, but certainly Max Good in this documentary is presenting for us to consider, if you're of the view that these men were not just two buddies going out for a beer and a little political intrigue together, but that instead they really weren't buddies at all. They didn't know each other that well, but they were joined in a common effort to keep tabs on the political extremes. We're left with that idea of Michael Paine has this odd set of details about him, his top secret clearance, his political interests, his political heritage, and then the fact that he was hanging out with Lee Harvey Oswald and going to these extremist political meetings. Very strange. Next, we're given the information, which I teased in the first chat that we had, that Ruth was the one who connected Lee with the job at the school book depository. She finds out through a contact of hers that there's an opening. And so I called down and made arrangements for Lee to come for an interview. And he got the job. That's how she tells it. And you need to know, too, that he only got this job maybe 6 weeks before the assassination. He was not the one to go and pursue this. He didn't prearrange. The only option you have if you're going to try to pin this whole assassination only on him is to have the view that he was just kind of a lone nut who all of a sudden did the mental calculations and was like, I think JFK is going to be right here in front of me and I'm just going to go ahead and take my chance. But if you believe that there was some sort of larger plan here, then moving him into a situation where he's implicatable is very fascinating. There's this letter that Lee Harvey Oswald is supposedly typing to the Soviet Union, and it makes assertions that Lee Harvey Oswald was somehow trying to make connections with the KGB. There's good reason to believe that this letter actually was planted by Ruth and Michael Paine. They are the only ones who had access to this letter, and they actually made a copy for the FBI after all of this assassination stuff was being researched. And the Soviets thought the letter was phony. As they read it, it did not sound like anything that the defectors or people who were trying to feel out the KGB for a possible connection did. They actually flagged it internally and said this is a forgery of some kind, and the Soviets accused Michael Paine and Ruth Paine of having forged this letter. Now, this might all sound kind of like random details, and I'll tell you, I'm doing less of a good job weaving it together for sure than Max Good does in this documentary. That's just another reason for you to go ahead and go and either rent this documentary or go ahead and purchase it if this whole subject is fascinating to you like it is to me. I've got a link in the description so that you can know which one I'm talking about. But it is watchable, it's downloadable on Amazon. That's where I own it. JFK is assassinated. Right after the newly installed President Johnson makes it back to the White House, he has a phone call with the FBI Director Hoover, and the audio for that file was erased. But the transcript was declassified in 1993. And the topic was evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, I want to remind you that this is within 12 hours, maybe 20 hours of the assassination. And they have already honed in on Lee Harvey Oswald and have all sorts of information about him that if you haven't looked into it, it's worth looking up. You can do a quick search. There was a man who had gone into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, and I believe the Cuban embassy as well, and it was applying for basically permission, visas, and travel documents to get into those two countries. That guy was there at the same time that Lee Harvey Oswald was in New Orleans, but that person was presenting himself as if he was Lee Harvey Oswald. applying for documents to get into these Soviet and Soviet adjacent countries. And LBJ and Hoover are discussing the man in Mexico City in this first phone call. And they're noting it doesn't look like him, it doesn't sound like him on the video, and reports are it's not him. Again, all very strange. This happened more than 2 months before the assassination. There's been an attempt to make it like, oh yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald was trying to get out of America. He was trying to go and live in these other countries. Well, even in that first conversation, President Johnson and Hoover are talking about the Lee Harvey Oswald impersonator in Mexico City and giving indication it doesn't actually look like him or sound like him. Word on the ground is it wasn't him. Why is somebody impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald trying to get into these other countries? So we're given a lot of questions here. I mean, I've already raised several here. Who was he? Was he a real defector? Were people impersonating him? Was someone impersonating him in Mexico City? Was he someone who was stoking political divide on the issue of Cuba? For and against Castro, for and against Cuba, for and against America having a strong relationship or an antagonistic relationship with Cuba. Was he essentially playing the part of what we kind of hear in our current political situation, that there's this like right-wing extremists, and then you find out it's a bunch of FBI guys who were planning this plot, and then like 2 guys on 4chan or something. So it's like a group of FBI guys along with some losers, but we're expected to believe it was this right-wing group planning this terrorist plot. And it's like, no, that's a bunch of feds planning stuff. And is this just that? Is this the federal government in its infancy stoking political divide on an issue that would keep people occupied? We already know that the CIA was wanting to push JFK toward, high conflict through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that he was irritated by it. And so we know that our government agencies had a stake in the ground and were trying to prod toward antagonism on a political issue. So is that what was happening here? We don't know. Ruth ends her little diatribe about, well, yeah, I got him the job, and yeah, Michael and I had this call, and we decided there was nothing to all this spy business. There was no connection. We didn't really understand that. She says, I just thought Lee is likely not a spy. Again, we have Ruth explaining Lee's motives away. For someone who he wasn't allowed to live in her house, she had few conversations with him. We're told that he barely responded to her in conversation. She does a lot of explaining of his motives. He was a small man. He had big goals for himself. He thought he was going to be great. She got him the job at the school book depository. And she's the one telling us, I don't think he's not likely a spy. I think we're going to get into one more element that's fascinating about Ruth Paine before we wrap up our little chat. And that is this, that Ruth Paine was a critical source for evidence, and not just her garage gun, right? For someone who Lee Harvey Oswald never actually lived with, you might just expect, oh, well, he stashed his gun in there because he was kind of living a life of, living in this place, moving into this boarding house, staying in this room. So he just stored his safe gun right there, right? But what we find is that actually she had some interesting things that were taken by the Warren Commission. The Warren Report notes that there were several large filing cabinets in Michael Paine and Ruth Paine's garage, and that it was full of note cards surveilling leftists and communists, that the people who cataloged what was taken said there were filing cabinets full of note cards surveilling leftists and communists in the Dallas area. Is that what you keep in your garage? I mean, it's so absurd. These people, they're just like, oh yeah, no, I had all these CIA connections, and oh yeah, no, I'm the one showing up to all these events and telling everybody what Lee Harvey Oswald thought and felt and wanted out of life. And oh no, yeah, I have all these connections to, historic patriots and very wealthy people and military contractors and all the rest. And oh yeah, no, we attend some far left wing and far right wing activities together. We just like to do that. We just like to talk about politics. We just like to, catch up about the things that we like. But I didn't really like him. He was a small man, and I didn't want to pay any attention to him. And he really had these two big ideas. But, we went to political meetings together 6 times because, I didn't like him. None of that makes any sense, y'all. When you stop to think about these facts just around Michael and Ruth Paine, none of this makes any sense. Do you spend time going 6 times to extremist meetings with someone that you don't even like, that you think is a small person who has big ideas about being a big person, and he's kind of sketchy and he's on the edges of society, and you don't really like this guy? Who does that? Who spends that much time with somebody that you don't even like? And going somewhere where you could be accused of all sorts of extremist choices with someone who has already defected and been a polarizing figure in America. None of that makes any sense to me unless there was actually intelligence work going on. And I don't know, I'm not saying that they were either both known agents, like Michael Paine and Lee Oswald have both openly said, hey, we're both working for the agency and we're both gonna go in and monitor these people. I don't know that. I don't know if Michael and Ruth are being kind of given like shepherding, like, hey, we're passing, like George DeMorenshield was in charge of them and then we're passing them off to y'all. I don't fully understand, but I will say there are odd circumstances surrounding Michael and Ruth Paine, and this set of filing cabinets is one of the key pieces. It was cataloged in the Warren Commission, it was described, and guess what? The contents go missing. I mean, you can almost imagine from the beginning that that's going to happen, right? If this is legitimate. Now, if they were just weirdos who kept up with stuff, then it would have still been in the commission report, right? But if they are government agents who are doing what they're supposed to do, then it makes perfect sense that as Alan Dulles and others with CIA connections are in charge of the Warren Commission, that the contents of the actual activities that Ruth and Michael Paine were doing for the CIA would go missing. I'll close with this. When she talks about this in the documentary, Max Good gives us this wonderful time of her talking to a group, describing these things. And she said, oh, those old cabinets. She said, well, there were some old recipes. There was some gardening tips. Yeah, I mean, if you want my old gardening tips, then you might want my little small cabinet. So she describes it as these 2 little small filing cabinets that had some gardening tips. They had a few recipes, a few things she wanted to remember, some articles she had clipped out. But no note cards describing leftists and communists. No. Big, tall no. These were tiny cabinets with some gardening tips inside, y'all. She just wanted her seeds, and they took them, and she never got them back, and she never did get those seeds back. It's just a bunch of baloney. So we'll close there. Plenty to discuss. Tell me what you noticed. Tell me if you've watched the documentary since the first little chat we had. And what have you been fascinated by about Ruth Paine? I think she's a very, very interesting person. And the more you look at her, the less makes sense. So that's chat number 2. I hope you guys enjoy these. I hope you have a great day. Bye.